We're not broken, we're wounded. These are the words of Dr. Gabor Maté, a man who has helped millions understand that trauma isn't a life sentence. In a world that tells us to suppress our pain, numb our emotions, or get over it, he offers a different message. You are not flawed. Your pain has meaning. And deep beneath the wounds, you are whole. This isn't about fixing yourself. It's about finally listening to your story with compassion, not judgment.
But in writing this book, I talked to a woman who was diagnosed with terminal uterine cancer. She was told she had a few months to live. That was over 20 years ago. And she actually began to write a book about dying well. But turns out she didn't die. And what she found out was that in order to live well, you have to know, no, in order to die well, you have to know how to live well. So the two are completely holding hands, just as you say. And in finding out how to die well, her uterine cancer spontaneously went away. I'd like to begin with the interview with, not with your story, which I want to go back to, but with something that you learned. And you learned so much, and you teach so much in your book. But towards the end of the book, you have this long poem of yours, The Infinite Ache. At the end of it, you say, for you're pregnant with yourself. Can you just speak those lines? Do you remember those lines to speak them to our audience?
I don't recall those lines. I can look really quick to see if I can find them in my...
Well, I have them here, if you like.
Oh, good. Yeah, what are they?
For you're pregnant with yourself, and you, and it has its own gestation period, because you cannot force nature, only nurture it. So, can you just talk about that? Because it's all about, everybody's listening here is wanting to get born as their true selves. And that's what you're addressing in those lines.
Something, I moved out when I was 15, and I was really struck with this idea of nature versus nurture. And if I received poor nurture, would I ever get to know my nature? Or was I already programmed? Was it over, so to speak? Which is a really depressing thought to think when you're 15. I knew that as much as I had a genetic inheritance, I also had an emotional inheritance, this emotional language that had been passed on generationally. And we had a bunny named Caramel when I was young, and it was raised with chickens.
No, Caramel played with the chickens.
It did.
Yeah.
And it thought it was a chicken, and it would peck at food, and it would waddle.
Yeah.
And it would actually lay on the nests for the hens, and it would hatch the eggs for the hens.
Yeah.
And it was very cute until I moved out when I was 15 and realized, what if I'm a bunny that was raised by chickens? And what if I never get to know my real bunny nature? And it was terrifying. And I wanted to see if there was a way to get to know my authentic self beneath the programming that I had received, the neural programming. Those words weren't around then, neural programming and those things, but the idea of nature versus nurture was, and it, through just curiosity and introspection and writing, it led me on this journey. And I had a lot of death in my life. I didn't die, but a lot of letting go, a lot of emotional death, a lot of trauma. And I came to find a still point in, it's hard to put words to. I came to find a still point in death, a way to relax and dilate and open, and how it connects you to life in a new and profound way. And the blessing of it, it's funny, it makes me tear up right now. The blessing of a good death, of letting go, of trusting death, of trusting nature, of trusting that process, of allowing that grief and that wave and that darkness and the comfort in it. Oddly, I was able to find a real comfort there instead of resisting it. And then I'm very visual, and so I would begin to see this sort of glimmering on a horizon in this really dark space. And I was struck with the idea that, death and life hold hands, and you can't have one without the other. And so just as I'm dying, as I was writing this poem, and that book was after a divorce, there was also a part of me being born. And so you have one foot in each world. And so there would be days I would just tend to my death. And then there would be days I would get very curious about what my next life was, and realizing that the quality of my death dictated the quality of my next life, emotionally, of course.
It's interesting you should say. Interesting you should say that, because I'm just writing a new book, and I actually ended up having just discovered your book, but right away I grabbed a passage from it, which I'll quote to you later, that I'm going to cite in my own book.
It's, I don't mean to drive the conversation. I'll let you ask another question, but yeah, it brings up so many things.
Please, I want to hear your thoughts.
So when I did pretty good when I was 15. I moved out and was paying rent. I started having panic attacks when I was 16. I didn't know what they were. There was no word for them that I knew of at that time. They continued. I began to kind of find these ways, again, through kind of introspection, of getting myself out of them, and then even realizing I could ask myself questions, which was an amazing process. And then I ended up in San Diego and wouldn't have sex with a boss, and started living in my car, and my car got stolen, and I was homeless. 'Cause I'm better without what you call love, I swear. When you take a look at me, you only see what you wanna see. Somebody who can move on. Don't tell me. And my panic attacks turned into agoraphobia and shoplifting. I was shoplifting a lot.
Beginning with carrots.
Beginning with carrots. I was very interested in the toll that the stress was having on my body. I was beginning to have kidney infections and chronic bladder infections, and I wanted to understand food as medicine. And again, those words weren't around then. It was so hard. I know it's hard for people to imagine now, but like the late 80s and early 90s, there was not the internet, and finding out things was very difficult.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to understand which vitamins and minerals helped, mucosal linings and inflammation and those types of things. And so I was very into healthy eating. So while I was homeless, I was shoplifting organic food, because if you're going to steal something, you might as well make it healthy.
For the bladder, you need cranberries.
Not just, like marshmallow root and things that help, build. After so many infections, the bladder lining gets rough and no longer smooth. And so finding things that help build mucosal linings, not just dealing with the pH balance, which is sort of, what cranberry juice is doing. But anyway, I was stealing a dress one day, and I looked at myself in the mirror and realized my big goal at 15, moving out of not wanting to be a statistic. I was a statistic. I didn't beat the odds, so to speak. And I remembered this quote that happiness doesn't depend on who you are or what you have. It depends on what you think. And so I decided to see if I could turn my life around one thought at a time. But I had so much chronic anxiety, I couldn't perceive my thoughts in real time. Because I was just disassociating all the time. And so I had this little hack of, I decided that your thoughts are cooled down and slowed down into action, and your hands have to actuate thought. So maybe I could see what I was thinking by studying what my hands did all day. And so I started taking notes for 2 weeks. I just wrote everything down that my hands did. I had no idea what I was looking for. It was just the only thing I could think of to do. And at the end of 2 weeks, I looked back at what I wrote, and there were, some takeaways. I quit believing in myself and some things like that. But the much more interesting thing was that my panic attacks had gone away, and I hadn't noticed that my panic attacks had gone away till I sat down, and it was a massive side effect that I wasn't expecting of this little 2-week study of watching my hands. And what I had stumbled onto was presence. Again, I don't think I remember hearing that word at the time, but what I had stumbled onto was that my worry was a thief, and it was causing me to project a past experience onto a future that hadn't happened. And it was kind of like, if I wanted to keep my house safe, it was like leaving my house to go look for burglars. When I had to stay in my house to keep myself safe, I had to be in the actual moment. And that moment was the only chance I had of actually keeping myself safe and advocating for myself. And that discovery was very exciting to me. And so I began taking more and more notes and studying more and more just within myself. And one of the things I noticed is that there were only 2 basic states of being I had. And that was it. There was 2 basic states, and it was dilated or contracted. And then I realized every single thought, feeling, or action led to one of those 2 states. And so I began to keep track in my notebook. I had a section for dilated and a section for contracted. And then I had 3 subsections.
By dilated, do you mean expanded, expansion?
Yeah, expansion.
Expansion or
Yeah. I use dilated just because I think of, birthing and breathing, but all the same thing. And so I had thinking, feeling, and doing. And so for a month, I just wrote down every time I was able to notice in my body when I felt relaxed, open, dilated, expanded, I would write down immediately what was I just thinking, feeling, or doing. And then every time I felt tight, contracted, body posture turned inward, I would write down what was I thinking, feeling, or doing. And I noticed a real pattern. And that was my internal dialogue. And that was it was a cheat sheet, I guess. It was a way of coming to know myself better. And
allow me to interrupt for a moment. When I read your biography, which is really a luminous piece of writing, I just love the sheer language of it, it was almost like I was watching a double consciousness. There was that inner self that from a very young age, and you seemed to be quite aware of what was going on. And even seemed to be aware that you are not what you were acting out. And you were writing all that stuff down. So there was that awareness that seemed to somehow either possessed you or you possessed it from a very early age on. And at the same time, there was this person who was confused and dissociated and traumatized and gets into all kinds of trouble that they unwittingly generate for themselves. And the book is almost like the 2 eventually coming together so that the awareness and the consciousness becomes dominant, becomes the one in charge. Is that an act? But it's unusual to see that presence and that awareness arise at such an early age. Am I describing something that you're recognizing in yourself? Because I'd love to have your comments on that. Because most people don't seem to be that self-aware as you seem to have been. And you used to write it down. It's almost like you had a double life. The life that you lived and the life that you wrote to yourself privately.
No, yes, that it does feel that way. It did feel that way. When I was young, it made me feel pretty crazy. I sort of had existential crises, however you say that word, when I was young. I remember sitting in church, and my older brother was 8, I was 5, and he was in a play, and it was all 8-year-olds. And to denote which 8-year-old was a boss, they wore a tie. And to denote which 8-year-old was a farmer, they wore overalls. And to denote which 8-year-old was a mom, they wore a little house dress. and the babies would wear diapers and things, but they're all the same age. And for some reason, it really, really freaked me out. I remember looking down the pew at my parents and realizing everybody was just acting and we're all the same. And it sent me into a real fit. I had a real, I guess you might even say, a depression. I don't know if that's possible to have at that age, but I remember feeling like I popped out of life. I popped out of reality, and I didn't know how to connect again for quite a while. I remember very, I don't know if you would say disassociative, but watching soccer games and being part of life later in the day, later in the week, and not knowing how to tie into what was real. Nothing felt real. And that type of thing would happen to me from time to time, which was difficult. It served me in a lot of ways. I was observant. And so when I was bar singing at 8, I saw that people were in pain. And I saw that people didn't know what to do with pain. And I could tell it was pain. And they were drinking or raging or engaging in sex or whatever it was. And nobody outran it. And I knew that I was in pain because my parents say again.
There's a wonderful phrase in your book about you can't outrun pain. You can't pain. And we all try to, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, it was such a gift that I saw that moment and realized I was in pain, and my dad had just began being abusive, and I made myself a promise to never drink or do drugs, and I made myself a promise to try and deal with it as it came. And if I didn't know what to do with it, I would put a pin in it. And writing helped. Writing put me in a state that just took the edge off the pain enough that it was tolerable. And then this fascinating thing happened is when I wrote, I realized I observed things that I didn't realize I had observed.
Right.
Or I would understand or have an insight to my dad maybe, or something that I didn't realize before that moment. And so I really turned to writing as my medicator, if you will. And later, when I was about 14 or 15 and had read Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And then again, pop forward to when I was 18, starting to kind of have these deeper experiences of trying to understand who I was beneath this programming. I realized, it isn't that I think, therefore I am. It's I perceive what I think, therefore I am.
That's right.
I'm actually the observer. I'm not my thoughts. There's a gap between the observer, what I'm observing, and my action. And so the bigger I could make that gap, when I could create a big pause, a big space between me observing and then cultivate observing better and better and building a bigger, stronger muscle for observing more consciously, more presently, more frequently, and then putting a pause before I created action, that was the image I had was a cocoon. Imagine a cocoon, like a chrysalis. And inside I saw all these swirling colors. And outside is this sort of gray, papery chrysalis cocoon. I had begun to believe that I was the chrysalis, the outside, the wrapping.
Yeah.
And that wrapping is actually all of the ways I was taught to behave. It was personality forming in front of us while we grow, all around us while we're growing, while we're having misunderstandings about our childhood, while we're developing responses to core wounds and core misunderstandings. Our personality begins to form, our opinions about life and our world and ourselves begins to form, but it isn't real necessarily. It's just a lot of assumptions that I made when I didn't know much better.
Yeah.
And actions, that build neural pathways and build life and build actions. And so being able to be the observer, I was able to associate that I'm the colors inside. And that's where I'm able to look at nurture versus nurture and go, I can re-nurture myself.
Mm-hmm.
Because as long as I start to learn how to act in accordance to the colors, my authenticity, as you would say too, then if I can have an experience of that, I had to create situations for me to have an experience of it. And then if I could form that into thoughts, feelings, and actions, my life would begin to be my own and not just a pre-programmed neural reaction, but a formed response. And that's how I began to really change the trajectory of my life.
As we close this journey through Gabor Maté's profound narrative, You Can't Undo Pain, we're left with a truth that resonates deep within. Pain is not something to outrun or erase, but a teacher that shapes us. Maté reminds us that the wounds we carry, whether from childhood, trauma, or the weight of a fragmented world, are not our defeat, but our doorway to healing. By facing our pain with courage and compassion, we uncover the resilience to rewrite our stories. Let's carry this wisdom forward, embracing the messiness of our humanity, knowing that in acknowledging our pain, we find the strength to become whole.